All right, for this lab, we're going to be looking at blood basics. So let's start with what is whole blood? Whole blood is going to be composed of two parts, plasma and formed elements. The fluid portion of blood, so about 55% of whole blood, is plasma. And the cellular portion of blood, so about 45% of whole blood, is the formed elements. Another way to name the formed elements is say cellular components. It includes things like erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets. Another name for erythrocytes is red blood cells. Another name for leukocytes is white blood cells. Another name for platelets is thrombocytes. Still, if we spin blood, it'll actually settle out into its components, with 55% being plasma, which is at the top because it's the least dense or not as heavy as the other components in spun blood, with the middle being the buffy coat that contains white blood cells and platelets, and with the bottom, the heaviest, densest component being the hematocrit, which is the percent of red blood cells in whole blood. So it's at about 45%. And we can also even talk more about whole blood, about the yellowish liquid portion, the plasma, and what it holds, like vitamins and clotting factors and proteins, red blood cells, and their general goal of carrying oxygen to our cells. White blood cells and how they help destroy infectious agents called pathogens because they function within the immune system, and platelets, which participate in blood clotting and contain clotting factors that help prevent the loss of blood through a process called hemostasis. But there's really a lot to look at versus just looking at kind of the general components and general functions. So let's take a closer look at blood plasma. Again, it's 55% of whole blood. It has that yellowish straw colored kind of sticky fluid appearance, and it contains numerous things, including mostly water, respiratory gases, oxygen, and carbon dioxide, nutrients like ions, amino acids, sugar, lipids, vitamins, and trace elements, and waste, urea and bilirubin. We've talked before about hormones and they travel via the blood, so it makes sense that it's in the blood plasma. What we're going to focus the most on are plasma proteins, albumin, globulin, and fibrinogen. Now, when we're talking about plasma proteins, probably the most important one, at least by weight, is albumin. Albumin helps maintain osmotic pressure, basically keeps water in the blood so we don't have blood pressure drop continuously. So, albumins help draw water into blood vessels by osmosis. Globulins, on the other hand, have kind of a dual function depending on the type. They might be immunoglobulins, those are antibodies meant to attach to foreign invaders and really help the white blood cells, the leukocytes, attack potential viruses and bacteria. Then you have transport globulins that help get things that are water soluble substances from one place to another in case they have to go, say, through a lipid soluble area, or vice versa, something lipid soluble through an area that's very water soluble. And then fibrinogen is an example of a chemical that's similar to clotting factors that aids platelets with blood clotting. So that is kind of the composition of whole blood. We've looked at its major components, but we still have to look at the formed elements. Even though most of whole blood is plasma, that's the major component, we can't forget the cells. So let's look at erythrocytes. Again, erythrocytes stands for red cell. So these are red blood cells. So what are their shape? They are biconcave. They kind of have this indentation on both sides that gives them 30% more surface area, making sure that no part of this cell is too far from hemoglobin, the protein they carry that helps carry oxygen. Red blood cells don't have a nucleus, and they don't have mitochondria. They get rid of many of their organelles and their nucleus before they mature. So they're essentially an oxygen carrying raft. And each red blood cell has about 280 million hemoglobin molecules, and it's able to hold many different molecules of oxygen. Actually, hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen molecules, so 4O2, 4 oxygen molecules per hemoglobin. The basic structure of hemoglobin is 4 polypeptide chains, each with a central heme group, the heme being a red pigment, and inside that heme group, you have a central iron atom that actually bonds to oxygen. So in hemoglobin, oxygen binds to iron. Now, red blood cells are a key component when it comes to the formed element. They make up the hematocrit. They're the densest component, especially when you're looking at spun blood, but they're the heaviest formed element. And they transport oxygen through the body. So they're really going to be able to get oxygen to our cells so they can carry out cellular respiration. Now, the fact that they are enucleated or anucleated, they have no nucleus. And they don't have most organelles, means they don't last very long. They're made in the red bone marrow, but they only last about 3 to 4 months. But luckily, we can make more. About 1 to 3 million red blood cells enter the bloodstream per second. And we're talking about red blood cells, and we're talking about cells that carry oxygen. Usually, we say those red blood cells have oxyhemoglobin, and those without or have less are deoxyhemoglobin. But throughout their lifespan, they're still able to work and carry out the process of transporting oxygen to our tissues. But their lifespan is a problem. They do start to kind of decay and they don't get through capillaries very well. They start to build up in certain organs like the spleen. That's oftentimes called the red blood cell graveyard because we see a lot of red blood cells kind of end up in the capillaries of the spleen. And then they have to be broken down, and some of its components can't just be released into the body. So heme, which when stripped of iron, still has to be converted into biliverdin and bilirubin, and it'll actually exit the body. Iron has to be recycled, it has to be stored, or it has to be transferred using special globulins. And globin, the protein chains, are broken down and they can be reused because they're just amino acid subunits. So luckily we can replace red blood cells and they can continue, the new ones, their process of carrying oxygen throughout our body. But if we don't break down red blood cells correctly, we can end up with things like a buildup of hemoglobin in the blood. And that can actually put a lot of strain on the kidneys. So, something like the breakdown of hemoglobin in red blood cells is very closely regulated. And then the formation of red blood cells is closely regulated, also by the kidneys using a hormone called erythropoietin, or EPO for an abbreviation. All right, so for red blood cells, they have an oxygen carrying capacity, they're biconcave in shape, they don't have a nucleus, and they're able to not only carry oxygen, but they're also able to get it to our cells so they can perform cellular respiration. But let's look at leukocytes next. So instead of looking at one cell, we actually need to look at 5 different types of cells, 3 of which are called granulocytes, and they use their granules in order to carry out their function. They are the basophils, eosinophils, and neutrophils. Then you also have the monocytes and the lymphocytes. So that's what we're going to look at next, is these white blood cells and their structure and function.